It's one of the most iconic and dramatic sites in the state. It's also the scene of a high-stakes land deal, stirring division over what's public versus private.
The deal was finalized in January. The Crazy Mountain Land Exchange swaps Forest Service parcels for private ones.
It's our rich man's playground, and we are not even allowed to hunt here hardly anymore. It's getting tougher and tougher. We're losing the sweetgrass access point, which is critical.
This super wealthy guy buys all this land that includes this Forest Service road that's very important. He shuts it down. Then he uses that as leverage to get public land in a land swap that hugely benefits him alone rather than the public. Is that what you just described?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. There's sort of a new land rush going on in the West, and the new one has less to do with land for mining or for cattle or oil drilling or anything like that. It's all about real estate and luxury housing, resorts.
If this continues, how many public trails are we at risk of losing access to?
They estimated that if all imperfected roads and trails went away overnight, that the Forest Service would lose access to more than half of its roads. So we're talking likely like a majority of the trails and roads that the public uses to access public land. Just like to give you another example, in Colorado, billionaire Kelsey Warren, the co-founder of Energy Transfer Partners, the company that built the Dakota Access Pipeline, he had bought a ranch in Colorado, the Bootjack Ranch, about $46.5 million ranch. And then he also later bought this Valle Seco in-holding in the San Juan National Forest, and then locked a gate across a Forest Service road that accessed thousands of acres of National Forest land. And then basically made it clear that if the agency declined to trade him lands adjacent to his Bootjack Ranch, in exchange for that in-holding, that they expected he would proceed with his plans to fence in the in-holding, turn it into an elk farm, and build a hunting lodge. Not surprisingly, the agency made the trade. Now, the Forest Service counts only one remaining public access along the Crazy Mountains' entire southeastern flank. So it's a huge chunk of the mountains is virtually inaccessible. These access closures means that private landowners have made it much more difficult for the public to access more than 22,000 acres of Custer Gallatin National Forest land. The Crazy Mountain landowners have, for many years, made it clear what they want in exchange for quote-unquote resolving these trail disputes. They want national forest land. They want public land. So take, for example, elk hunting or something. A lot of people in the area, they hunt elk and deer and fill their freezers that way. It's pretty cheap. You can get an elk tag for $20 or something like that, and then you can set yourself up with a freezer full of meat. But if you can control access to the elk herds, you can sell elk hunts for $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 each. They control access up that road. They can close it off. I find it really hard to sort of overstate the value and the importance of these public lands. They're the bedrock of a proletarian rural culture. This is where people who don't have a lot of money can take their kids camping for free, go out there and go fishing for free, go hunting for free, go, wander around and enjoy some, just like doing whatever they want without anybody telling them what to do for free. I think it would be sort of impossible to overstate the value of that in a person's life. And you don't really quite know maybe how valuable that is until it's gone. And so when it comes to things like hunting or, getting firewood off these public lands, these are economically valuable places. These are places where people can get the things that they need to live, and by doing so, steal back a little bit of their time from the money economy and from wage labor by going and filling their freezer with meat, with elk meat, or go and spending a day or two cutting firewood and setting themselves up with a heating source for their house for the winter. I mean, there are families that I know for whom it would be a legitimate hardship if they didn't kill an elk. And a lot of the time, the problem is not proving public rights to these trails and roads that are being blocked. It's getting public agencies to do anything about the landowners blocking them. And she told me, if I trespass on someone's land, I'll get a ticket within an hour. If I block off the public's access to a river, there might never be a citation. Pretty well sums it up.
Today on Public Research, as wealth sweeps across Montana and the Intermountain West. In these times, magazine's Rural America editor Joseph Bullington joins us to discuss his shocking expose, How to Privatize a Mountain, which details how landowners are increasingly blocking the public from public lands all across the Mountain West. 40 miles east of Bozeman, Montana, and roughly an hour north of Yellowstone National Park, sits the picturesque railroad town of Livingston, Montana. And just a short drive north of Livingston lie the Crazy Mountains. The Crow tribe hold the Crazy Mountains in deep reverence. They call them the Ominous Mountains in their language, and the range features prominently in their history and spiritual practices. Documented by the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, the Crazies remain a place of cultural significance and a haven for wildlife and outdoor enthusiasts. Outdoor enthusiasts like my guest today, Joseph Bullington.
I mean, I think, growing up in the area, I kind of took the Crazies and places like them for granted a little bit. That was, my family would go into the mountains on a, almost a weekly basis to go camping and just take a walk. So I grew up pretty used to that kind of access to that kind of public land just pretty regularly and pretty easily. So I first remember the Crazies themselves. I first remember exploring them with the first trips deep into the mountains with my dad and my younger brother, and we started doing these week-long backpacking trips when my brother and I were in our early teens. We tried out a few different ranges. We've been into the Beartooths and the Absarokas and a lot of different ranges in Montana, but the Crazies they were kind of our special spot. We started going back to them year after year. We kind of found this little spot that we liked, way up in the high Crazies above tree line. And yeah, many weeks, many summers we'd spend a week in that spot.
Just for the audience, if they don't know the geography, this is near Livingston, Montana, near Bozeman, near Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah.
It's north of there. One thing you talk about in the article that's important for people to understand is this checkerboard property ownership. So, which I think means that there's it's a sort of complex mix of, you have to drive through, I guess, private property to get to the public property, right?
So like I mentioned in the article, all of that land was originally set aside by the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty as part of the Crow Reservation, the Crow Nation. That was Crow country. It was in the 1860s that the federal government was trying to promote the westward expansion of America, and was trying to subsidize transcontinental railroads, because railroads are the drivers of colonization in the West, the big drivers. And so to do that, they offered these land grants where for every mile of track that a railroad built, they could claim. It started off as 5 and later became 10 square mile sections, odd numbered sections, so every other section on either side of the track. And so you have these everywhere a railroad track goes through in the West, in most parts. If you look at the maps on either side, any place that passes through what remains public land, you'll see these this checkerboard pattern of private and public ownership, and that's the legacy of these railroad land grants.
So as a child, you and your family, you were able to access these trails pretty easily, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that all public land is surrounded by private land. You know, you don't get to public land except by crossing private property. So whether it's by trail, street, or whatever, it depends on some kind of public easement across private property, in almost all cases. So in the case of the Crazies, yeah, we didn't face obstructions. We were, you know, I think I mentioned in the article, as we explored the Crazies, we never, you know, met a no trespassing sign or had somebody fussing at us to get off the land. It was a more laid back time. People cared a lot less about people weren't trying to assert ownership over the sort of private inholdings in that mountain range the way they are today.
And the Crazies are sacred, right, to the Crow Indians. Is that the case?
Yeah, there's a really fascinating history there. The Crazies are, among many other things, they're a site where Crow people historically and to this day go to ask for dreams, to, you know, on vision quests. And one of the most important, I mean, if you can make hierarchies out of such thing, one of the most important vision quests in probably Western history happened on Crazy Peak, and that was the last traditional Crow chief. Plenty had a vision on when he was a young boy. I think he's like 12 or a young teenager. Had a vision on Crazy Peak that would shape the future of the Crow people and also the West at large. It really influenced how the tribe approached, you know, white expansion into their territory. And yeah, there's a great book by.
What was the vision?
I can't probably give it in full details.
Right.
Basically, the vision is he sees the disappearance of the buffalo, and he sees the spreading of what people would later interpret to be cattle spreading across the plains. And then there's a great storm that wipes out the forest. And I'm probably missing a lot of things, but when he takes it back to the tribe and to the people who interpret these dreams and makes sense of what these the dreams these young kids are having up, you know, up on the peaks. The way that they interpret it is to at the end of the storm, there's a chickadee is safely in one of the trees, and so they take it as a sign to sort of follow the way of the chickadee and kind of keep your head down and hold tight, and let the storm of colonization kind of pass over you and try to weather it. And so you know, the Crow didn't wage wars against, you know, the white colonizers the way that like some of their neighbors like the Lakota did. They collaborated in some cases, and they've you know, their goal was survival, tribal survival, you know, national survival.
Do you happen to know what year this was on the top of your head?
Oh, I don't know what year we had
Okay,
the vision,
so
but it's I don't know that anyone knows exactly
I
what year
only
it would be.
ask because you say he saw the disappearance of buffalo, and I'm just curious, was it well before that? Because that would be amazing.
It was well before the disappearance of those northern herds. I don't know if the southern herds were probably already taking pretty heavy losses because that Southern Railroad went in earlier, but I don't know the years and all this. And like I said,
Right.
I don't know that anybody knows what year Plenty had that
Right.
had that vision. Yeah.
So you went back to the Crazies with some friends. What happened?
Well, so when we set out to walk this trail called the Porcupine Lowline, which is a trail it's been on Forest Service maps for about 100 years. When we set out to walk it in 2018, you pretty quickly, about a half mile in, you hit the edge of the the public land where the trail is going to start crossing private land before it comes back onto the national forest. And at that boundary, the landowner had we ran straight into a fence and a bunch of private property, no trespassing, no Forest Service access signs, and had clearly turned back most of the people before us. The trail got pretty faint at that point. The signs had their desired effect.
So, but you eventually end up having contact with the police. So
Yeah,
how did that happen?
we crossed the fence because we wanted to understand this trail. At the time, the Forest Service was negotiating a deal which would eventually abolish that trail, and did a couple of years later, and reroute it into a different area. And so, as the public debate or public discussion about this was going on, my two friends and I all worked at the local newspaper there in Livingston, Montana, and we wanted to try to understand the trail, and I think the idea was to write articles about what the public stood to lose and gain from this deal, and I didn't feel like I could do that without walking this trail. So we crossed the fence and did our best to follow the trail. It's about 8 or so miles down to where it comes to the next. It's a route between two historic Forest Service guard stations. So it starts at this one called the Porcupine Station, and kind of meanders through the foothills of the Crazies, about 8 miles or so to this one called the Ibex Station. So somewhere in there, we were really struggling to stay on. It got really faint, and all, like I said, I said in the story, all of the sort of waymarking signs and blazes were all gone from the trail. I think all day we passed only a single sign, which is not very many in 8 miles. And it's, with just a map and compass and a sort of fading line, it gets pretty hard to stay on.
So very clear, no trespassing, stay away, private property signs all over the place. And for no particular reason, very faint, here's the trail signs. Basically,
yeah,
right?
almost no trail signs.
No trail signs. Wow.
Yeah, except for there was trail signs at the trailhead, and then there was one somewhere deep along the trail. We saw one lone sign. My reporting, I got a bunch of Forest Service documents, and so these sort of internal Forest Service emails and letters talk about in these letters that the district ranger on that district of the forest is accusing the landowners and some of the other people, like this guy who runs a hunting club in the area, accusing them of taking down those trail signs and of making the trail more difficult to follow in general. There's other allegations that they were piling brush on the trail in different places, things like that.
And you're not, tell me if I'm wrong, you're not close to like a house, right?
No, it's a pretty remote area. It's no, this is not like going to the backyard of somebody's house, and there's no not really any buildings in sight.
There's nothing valuable for you to steal where you were.
Not unless you're trying to rustle cattle or something, which we weren't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're trying to enjoy this trail with some other people, and these guys come out on or this guy, I don't know how.
Yeah,
ATVs.
several.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this guy, this man approached us. They rolled up on us in ATVs about the time we were about as lost as we'd been all day. He was pretty aggressive right off the bat, but he asked, I can't remember what, told us we were on private property on a private ranch, and I told him we were on the Porcupine Lowline. When he told us that we were off the trail, and it turned out that he was right. We had lost the trail at one of the, it's as it kind of versus country, so he had taken a wrong turn up like a little ways back. Well, he told us we were on a private ranch. We're trespassing. He said we were that we were on the Porcupine Low Line. He basically told us that we weren't on the trail. He actually denied the existence of the trail there, but we were approached by this man that came in on ATVs. He came out of the ATV and told us we were on a private ranch. And I told him that we were on the Porcupine Low Line, and we had some disagreement about that. He told us that we weren't, and it turned out that he was right. One of those sort of unmarked intersections a little ways back where the trail crossed old logging roads and old animal trails and stuff. Without those blazes and trail marking signs, we had taken a wrong turn, so we had wandered off the trail a little ways. We weren't very far. We were just maybe 100 yards or so from national forest land when he caught up with us. But this guy, it turned out, we found out later, he didn't tell us at the time. Apparently, his name was Dave Labaugh. He was the ranch manager of the ranch that we were on at that point, and he's the managing member of a hunting club that operates in the area.
And it wasn't clear, right? It wasn't like it wasn't obvious, right, that you were off the trail.
Well, no, not to us, because it's, if you have a bunch of no trespassing signs and stuff blocking the trail blocking a public trail, it becomes very difficult to tell which no trespassing signs are sort of the illegal ones that are to block your access to a public trail, and which ones are the real ones.
So you get served a ticket right away that eventually results in you have to go to court, correct?
Yeah, so the Labaugh must have called us in, because the next day a sheriff's deputy from Park County found us at the newspaper office and gave us tickets for criminal trespass. And we tried to fight it in court. It's a whole saga that's not super interesting, but basically the Forest Service, we tried to subpoena the Forest Service to get them to testify about the obstructions that and the lack of signage that on these trails. We tried to get them to testify that about how landowners were trying to obstruct these trails, but they declined the subpoena, and the court, for whatever reason, quashed it, and so we ended up basically with nobody at trial who was able to testify to the fact that these trails were public trails that were being obstructed, and to testify to the various methods that landowners were using to obstruct them illegally. And so we were found guilty at that trial.
So how much was it was a fine, right?
Yeah, they didn't go after on any jail time for us.
Was it a big fine?
Yeah, I can't remember all the total of it.
Yeah, but they were
600 bucks or so, or maybe a little more.
But-
They tack on a bunch of fees and stuff when you go through the court system.
600. Wow.
Each, there was 3 of us, and I can't remember.
Wow.
There's probably some more fees and stuff like that on there.
For your crime, and then how you hurt the community.
Yeah.
Your crime of enjoying the mountains. So they're very prompt about giving tickets, seeking you out for this horrible crime of walking, near, I don't know, a public trail or something.
Yeah.
But they're not very interested in enforcing other laws, are they? When the landowners obstruct these trails, they don't have that kind of attitude, do they?
No, it's true. It's one of the big problems. And this was pointed out by one of my sources at the Public Land and Water Act. Let me just pull this up here and I can get the quote right. Yeah, this kind of contradiction and this disparity is pointed out by one of my sources that I quote in the story. And this woman, Drury Haynes, who is a public access consultant at the Public Land and Water Access Association, and that organization researches public access in Montana and keeps track of access that's being lost by landowners obstructing it. And she says a lot of the time that the problem is not proving public rights to these trails and roads that are being blocked. It's getting public agencies to do anything about the landowners blocking them. I think she told me if I trespass on someone's land, I'll get a ticket within an hour. If I block off the public's access to a river, there might never be a citation. Pretty well sums it up.
So let's look at the broader context. How has the economy in these areas changed?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've written about somewhat extensively over the last couple of years. There's a sort of a new land rush going on in the West. In a long history of land rushes for various forms of profit, and the new one, like I point out, has less to do with land for mining or for cattle or for oil drilling or anything like that. It's all about real estate and luxury housing, resorts. It's all about selling what they call outdoor amenities, tourist experiences, and that has that shift has really restructured a lot of rural communities are in the midst of this restructuring, especially where I'm from. Places like Colorado are a little further along on the path. And one of the main features of that, and this is something I've written about in a couple of other long form articles here in these times, one of the major features of that is the cost of living and housing costs in particular just going through the roof in these towns where there's not a whole lot of jobs left except for the service industry jobs and things like that. And so you just see, you see housing costs blasting way out of reach of the local wages. And honestly, you're seeing just kind of massive displacement happening in towns like Bozeman, Livingston. People who have lived there a long time are no longer able to live there. It's left kind of driving away, looking for the closest place that they can afford to live. See here.
It seems like Colorado, that had already been, for lack of a better term again, settled, pretty well. Denver, Boulder, and stuff. California, that they have mountains, but the housing market is crazy there.
Yeah.
And the Intermountain West.
Mhm.
These states have seen this huge real estate boom. I believe that Idaho had the hottest real estate market in the country, and Bozeman has seen this huge growth. I remember the first time I went to Bozeman, I was staying at a hotel, and as I went into the hotel, the manager just they said to me, "You're not from California, are you?" I said, "No, I'm from Illinois." And they're like, oh, good. And you can see it in Bozeman. They have these sort of fancy new modern style designed houses and workplaces all over. Do you recognize where you grew up, or how much has it transformed it?
Well, yeah, some of the places haven't changed all that much. The smaller towns.
Bozeman has.
Bozeman is very different from that's where we used to go every couple of weeks. We'd go to Bozeman and do a big shopping trip, or just get out of White Sulphur for a day. Bozeman's a very different place. It's very busy. It's very it used to be a small Montana city, pretty affordable, college town. It's no longer really anything like affordable. And it's just kind of you see, it's just it's a one big construction boom all up and down the Gallatin Valley, which is where Bozeman's at, and it's all the wrong kind of housing. It's all luxury housing. A lot of it, until recently, this is something I learned reporting on, doing reporting for a recent story about the tenants union that's fighting back in Bozeman. But a lot of it until recently was built to be, short-term rentals. They weren't even, developers weren't even pretending it was going to be normal housing or affordable housing. They were developing the valley straight, in the city directly to be, luxury short-term rentals.
Can you detail what exactly are these outdoor amenities?
Well, sure. I mean, it's a whole range of things. Housing and real estate are one of the big ones. I think it's about one of the big things for sale is proximity to these wild public lands that are left in the area. So the closer you get to Yellowstone, the more expensive it gets, basically. Access to the Yellowstone River, to rivers, is obviously high dollar. But it's also things like mountain biking tours, or even just mountain biking gear shops. It's things like guided hunts for trophy elk. It's guided fly fishing tours. It's it's the fancy restaurants. It's the whole spectrum of the economy that's angled to serve kind of high-end tourists and second homeowners and that kind of thing.
And so, yeah, and the people who came after you on the ATVs, right? They worked for one of these, am I right? One of these private sort of hunting ranches, right?
So I know I haven't been able to learn a whole lot about the ranch that they manage. I know that they were that Dave Labaugh was like I said, the managing member of a hunting club, which was a sort of,
I was
as I
mistaken.
understand it,
Sorry.
yeah, no, you're all right. It's a as I understand, kind of like let's see. I know that he said that he made money from this. So it's some kind of pay to hunt kind of deal. That's about the extent of what I can say based on my reporting, but I know that he made money from it, and that it was some kind of hunting club that was probably leasing the land, the hunting rights to the land in that area. But I think, so I mean, I'll tie it back together here. The sort of this boom in outdoor amenity, this booming outdoor amenity economy, and how it relates to privatization and the landscape there. So take, for example, elk hunting or something like that. Something that I've been doing for a long time. A lot of people in the area, they hunt elk and deer and fill their freezers that way. It's pretty cheap if you're a resident. You can do it for you got to pay for gas and all that stuff. But there's a lot of elk on public land. You can get an elk tag for $20 or something like that. And then you can set yourself up with a freezer full of meat. Yeah, if you put in the work. It's not easy, but but if you can control access to the elk herds, because by controlling access to the land, you can sell elk hunts for $5, $10, $15,000 each. And so so you have outfitters and ranches that lease their hunting rights to these outfitters that are these are, we're not talking about small sums of money. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in the crazies, it gets pretty specific. It's so along Sweetgrass Creek, the road that runs up Sweetgrass Creek and Trail, which is on the east side of the crazies, one of the beautiful major drainages on that east side. The Ryan Anchor Ranch, they control access up that road. They can close it off when they want to. Though there's a long history of public use of that road. And they also happen to hold outfitting permits to to sell guided elk hunts and other hunts on that land, on that public land that the public is blocked from accessing. And I think they list a, I think they sell an elk hunt for $5,500 or thereabouts.
Okay, this is extraordinary, and I couldn't believe it when I read your article. They get to shut down public access. How is that legal?
So this is, some of the most complicated stuff in the article. These old trails and roads, many of which, like I said, have been on these maps, on the Forest Service maps for 100 years or so. Like I think I say in the articles, the first rangers who, the first Forest Service rangers who were using these routes didn't necessarily secure recorded easements on all of them. It was like I said, I wasn't there, but I picture it as a sort of different time when there was a lot less people in the area. And as they're riding their work catches on these trails, nobody's, challenging their right to do that. I think it was just a different time. So as a result, we're now left with a lot of these trails that lack recorded easements where they cross these checkerboard sections of private land. A lot of these sections of trail are, this is according to a lot of access advocates, including Drury Haynes, who I talked about earlier from the Public Land and Water Access Association. But a lot of these stretches of trail and road are really good candidates for what are called prescriptive easements, which are awarded retroactively by a court. And what a prescriptive easement is it says that the public has been using this trail and enjoying, I can't remember all the legal terms, people can look it up on their own, but basically has enjoyed use of this trail for a certain period of time. I think in Montana it's 5 years. They can, if the agents like the Forest Service were willing, they could sue the landowner over these obstructions, go to court and lay out their case that they have a prescriptive easement on these trails and roads. They have so far refused to do that in any cases that I know of in the crazies. And as a result, the landowners who are blocking these trails and roads build up the opposite case, which is that if they can show that they have controlled access over these roads and trails for something like 5 years, they can build their case to take to court if it ever comes to that, to show that people have only used the trail with their permission for a certain period of time, and by doing that they can extinguish extinguish public trail rights and kind of take control of these 100-year-old trail systems, which have been, just to be clear, it's not like these are fringe or out of the ordinary or just weird little side trails. These are major trails and major roads in this mountain range and also all across the West that have been maintained with public money, by Forest Service maintenance. And there are hundreds, if or thousands of trails and roads like this. It's I think Public Land and Water Access estimates that if, for example, all the access points that are prescriptive, that are not perfected, which is the word for it, if they don't have a recorded easement, they estimate that if those all went away overnight, the Forest Service would lose access to as much as half of its roads. So this is not a small number of trails and roads that are in this condition.
For the ignorant among us, including myself, can you just clarify what an easement is?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, an easement is basically like like an easement would be. It's basically it's like saying that you have a legal right of way across an area, like a trail or road easement. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm just imagining from the sort of Illinois perspective, thinking about a public Lake Michigan beach, for instance. I'm just imagining how insane it would be if some rich guy, like, we went, oh, let's go to the beach today. And then you get there and some guys like closed the gate to
Sure.
of the little road to the beach.
Yeah.
And the mayor's like, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be unthinkable. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you do see this kind of thing across the country, though. It's you know, down here where I'm at in Louisiana right now, there's a spot I like to go out fishing, and I went out there not too long ago, and the little road I used to drive out to the edge of the bayou it's all blocked off with no trespassing signs now. You know, I don't know what the status of that road was. I just know that a lot of people used it and used it for a while. You go out there any Sunday, and there's a bunch of, you know, Latino families out there fishing, and you know, like, somebody's asserting their right to close that off, and nothing will ever be done about that. It's just a little fringe road. You know, I've run into more cases of that kind of thing in my life than I wish. I think there's a lot of that going on, wherever there's sort of valuable public space that people would rather have more exclusive access or use of.
So, I mean, if I told somebody like the article is about public easements and legal issues around public access, it would sound dry, but
Boring, yeah.
your article, which everybody needs to read in these times, this issue is fascinating because it reflects this class element. And one of the most interesting things is when I read your article, I was incensed, particularly about a legal case we'll talk about in a second, which is unbelievable. I told people what happened, and they're like, no, that's not true. So I looked this stuff up on YouTube, and the only people I could really find talking about it were these like hunting podcasts. And what's interesting is hunters who aren't very wealthy, they rely on these public trails, right? So they can hunt. And now they're being closed down, and often they're sort of being blocked to the benefit of these fancy hunting lodges, which are catering to this much more wealthy, often, you know, flying in from elsewhere class.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the billionaires have been coming to the mountains for a long time. Sun Valley in Idaho,
Sure.
that's been since the 80s at least. But I wonder, when you were growing up, how much has the presence of these billionaires increased in your mind?
Well, I mean, I don't know in any kind of statistics how much it's increased, but the presence, you know, the presence and influence of wealth and wealthy landowners in the state of Montana has you know, increased drastically in my lifetime. You know, and that's that's basically been the sort of beat that I've assigned myself the last year or two, is to write about how, you know, wealth is reshaping Montana and the West, you know, and the presence of more wealthy people, and, you know, the way that's changing communities and reshaping the landscape itself as they try to, you know, create more exclusive experiences for themselves, and as businesses try to you know, find new ways to squeeze money from the landscape. I think, you know, to something that's really important to me, and that you're getting at a little bit with this question about hunting and the different kinds of hunters. You know, I find it really hard to sort of overstate the value and the importance of public lands, to, you know, I think what do I say in the article? You know, I say that these public lands are they're the bedrock of a proletarian rural culture. This is where, it's like where people who, don't have a lot of money can take their kids camping for free, go out there and go fishing for free, go hunting for free, go, wander around and enjoy some, just like doing whatever they want without anybody telling them what to do for free. I think it would be sort of impossible to overstate that the value of that in a person's life. And you don't really quite know maybe how valuable that is until it's gone. And so like with hunting, which is particularly like you're pointing out, and like I've pointed out, when it comes to things like hunting or getting firewood off these public lands, these Forest Service lands in Montana, and these are economically valuable places, but and I mean that word in like a slightly different way than just like profit getting. These are places where people can get the things that they need to live, and by doing so, steal back a little bit of their time from the money economy and from wage labor, by going and filling their freezer with meat, with elk meat, or go and spending a day or two cutting firewood and setting themselves up with heating source for their house for the winter. And so you see it's like those are the two sides of the coin of like talk about hunting. There you have people who are who are hunting for, who are meat hunters, and there's still a lot of them left in Montana and elsewhere. And you have definitely another class of hunter, which is the trophy elk hunter, who will pay $10,000 for a guided hunt to go kill an elk, and those are very different things.
I thought you were going to say that these were very essential for people's mental health, which I think is true, and I think you say that in the article. To be able to get into nature, to enjoy the quiet and sort of recuperate and feel calm. There's obvious benefits for that, but it's people are actually, they need that meet the low income locals. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, I think there's definitely an element of that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are families that I know for whom it would be a legitimate hardship if they didn't kill an elk in the fall. But those tend to be dedicated hunters, and they tend to kill elk.
Let's talk about some of the billionaires and who are these characters. I don't know who the first big billionaire was to sort of set up camp out there. Is it Ted Turner moved out there decades ago?
Yeah, at some point. I'm not terribly familiar with that history, but yeah.
And then there's I saw the owner of the Atlanta Falcons, I think is his name Art Blank. He's out there.
Yeah, Arthur Blank. I wrote a story about him a while ago, but he's been buying up ranches all over Park County around Livingston, where I used to live.
Are there any other hugely wealthy names that come to mind as really important in this area?
Oh,
I get it.
I think that the people who are the companies and people who are most relevant to this story about the crazies. There's some of the major changes in the landscape that I know about are the result of this historic sort of family dude ranch in the crazies selling to this billionaire investor named David Lucian. So he took over a lot of the in holdings in the mountains back in 2013, I believe, or 2012, I can't remember which. And so David Lucian is he's one of the big names. I think his company is Riverstone Holdings. He's a big shot. I think also really significant in this article and just in general in Montana is this company called the Yellowstone Club, which is if you don't know what it is, or if the listeners don't know what it is, it's it's this ultra exclusive community near Big Sky, Montana, where membership costs millions of dollars. You have to buy a house in there and pay dues, and it's, among other things, boasts the only private ski resort in the world. So it's definitely a place for millionaires and billionaires to hang out with each other. And recently, the Yellowstone Club, through its parent company, Cross Harbor Capital, has been moving into the crazies. A few years ago, they bought the Crazy Mountain Ranch, which is this massive ranch on the southwestern end of the crazies. And yeah, it's the Yellowstone Club basically represents whether it's them or not, they represent the for a lot of Montanans, they represent sort of the kind of ultimate evil that this land could be used for.
Billionaire class. Any famous members or of the Yellowstone Club?
Oh, there's lots of famous members. I don't even know what the complete list would be now, but I know that I think that Tom Brady was a member, and Justin Timberlake, and I remember, I think Bill Gates is a member.
I want to talk about this specific court case because this is amazing. The way I was describing it to people was that some private landowner cut access to this trail that people love, and there was a legal case, and he said he didn't do anything wrong because in the time he was blocking access, the trail fell into disrepair. Thus, it's I guess the idea is it's no longer a public trail, and so he didn't do anything wrong. And then he won the case. The judge was like, "Yeah," but why don't you educate me on the actual details?
So I think you're probably talking about the lawsuit with the four access groups sued the Forest Service, arguing that the agency had, I think, to abandon its responsibility to manage the trails for public access, these crazy mountain trails. And this is about earlier with prescriptive easements and how they're won and how they're lost. And actually, it wasn't the landowner who argued this. It was the like the federal attorney, on behalf of the Forest Service. So the agency, the Forest Service, argued, through that federal attorney, that by 2018, when this lawsuit was brought, I believe, that the agency's prescriptive claims on those trails had likely been, quote, reversed and extinguished by years of little maintenance, low use, and landowner trail obstructions, which is basically exactly what District Ranger Alex Sienkiewicz, who had been advocating for these trails and trying to get, this is all based on Forest Service documents that I've obtained, but have been advocating for these trails and trying to get the agency to do something about landowners blocking them. He'd been warning this was going to happen for years because he's actually has a law degree and understands this prescriptive easements and how they work, and so he could see, and you can see this in his letters to his emails to his Forest Service bosses. He's basically pleading with them to take these landowners to court because he knows that he says the landowners are trying to run out the clock on these prescriptive easements, and by 2018. The federal government basically agrees that the landowners have effectively done that. Yeah.
I didn't get to the sort of hero of this piece, this ranger. So this guy is a great figure in my view. Why don't you, if you could, just give the background on this guy and what basically like well-connected landowners through the senators did to this guy.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting case, and I don't focus on it at length in the piece because other people have written about it elsewhere. So it's people who are interested can track that down. But to give the sort of brief review of it. So I have, this guy's named Alex Sienkiewicz, district ranger. He declined to talk to me for this story, but I have a lot of, public records, sort of his communications with landowners and with his other Forest Service employees and with, his bosses over the years. And so the documents that I have show him basically waging a campaign to defend the agency's claim to these obstructed crazies trails that landowners are blocking and trying to drive out of existence. They show him meeting with landowners. He leads maintenance crews, re-signing these trails and taking down obstructions. So starting in, I think, in 2017, this is right after the administration changes, the Trump administration takes power. Landowners start complaining about his aggressive attitude. They go to his bosses, they go to the Montana Republican Senator Steve Daines, and they go to Sonny Perdue, who's the newly appointed Secretary of Agriculture. And
Who I think is a billionaire himself, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know much about Sonny Perdue, but there's
the famous Perdue chicken family or whatever. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Go.
And then Senator Daines passes these concerns on to Forest Service Chief Thomas Tidwell, in May 2017 letter that I have. A few weeks later, the Forest Service abruptly reassigns Alex Sienkiewicz, removes him from his post as district ranger, which is, you're district ranger, you're the top dog on the forest. You have people, a few people.
They demote him, but before we get to that, what do they say their concerns are?
Well, so the landowners say that one thing that they criticize sort of Sienkiewicz's demeanor, saying he's being too aggressive about this, and but they basically argue that he's encouraging trespass to reestablish abandoned trails, because of, he sends this email to his staff at one point, which is later posted to this access group's Facebook page. In the email, it's an annual email that he would send, according to documents that I've seen. So he just tells his employees not to ask permission or sign in to use these public trails. He says by asking permission, one undermines public access rights and plays into their lawyer's trap of establishing a history of permissive access. And that's when that email gets posted onto a Facebook page of the Public Land and Water Access Association, is when landowners get really mad, and accuse him of encouraging trespass, basically.
It really is outrageous for the U.S. Forest Service to presume the right to access Forest Service roads. I mean, and they literally say his demeanor, like he smells bad. Like,
well, they talk about, they just talk about,
I don't like his attitude.
Yeah. Yeah. They didn't like his attitude. Yeah.
So these wealthy landowners go to this local senator and I believe this billionaire trumpetman official, Sonny Perdue.
Mm-hmm.
And then they demote this guy. Like what does he get reassigned to?
Yeah, so just to be clear about who these landowners are, because I want to be, as accurate as possible. So it's these people who are blocking trails, these ranches that are blocking trails are mostly, in this case, I think in the story in the Crazies, almost, I think they're not billionaires. These are most of them are longtime ranchers. But that doesn't mean they don't have an economic incentive in blocking access. And it also, it doesn't mean that billionaires aren't sort of waiting in the wings or other people aren't waiting in the wings to profit from this land in other ways. But just to be clear, these are mostly not billionaires. But they do have, political pull. They're kind of big time landowners in the area. And so they go, like you said, they go to their go to Senator Steve Daines. They go to Secretary of Agriculture Perdue. Senator Daines passes on their concerns to Forest Service Chief Thomas Tidwell, and yeah, and in a few weeks after that, the Forest Service removes Sienkiewicz from his post as district ranger and reassigns him to a role in the forest supervisor's office. They also announced an investigation into his conduct. They never released the findings of that investigation, but eventually he was reinstated without any at least no publicly released findings of wrongdoing. But yeah.
What's his status now?
No, he's a district ranger on that forest again. He was reinstated in I think October of that year. So he was removed for a few months. But the Forest Service's whole tone has changed since his reassignment. He's not we're gonna put this
He's
in the
not
most
the
accurate
old
possible.
fire breather he used to be on this topic.
Exactly. It's
Okay.
yeah, his that's
Got it.
I think that yeah.
I found the part of the article I think I was referring to before, where with the line, a federal judge ruled against the access groups. Now this was sort of amazing. I'm quoting you. The agency stunned many observers by dismissing some of the public trails. Sorry, I added public. As is already lost, it argued. By 2018, its prescriptive claims on some trails had likely, quote, been reversed and extinguished by years of little maintenance, low use, and landowner trail obstructions. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Forest Service, which is a government agency, basically is just being like, we don't really have a right to this public land. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah. Yeah. That's basically exactly what's going on. And that's what the access groups were suing the agency to try to make them protect those trails. And the agency's response to that was like, basically, actually, these trails are already lost. We no longer claim access rights to these trails. And that's kind of been their line over the last few years, especially as they entered into these negotiations with these East Side landowners who wanted to put together a land swap package that they wanted to trade for Forest Service land. And the agency kind of again and again has not asserted its rights to these public trails, which is kind of a baffling move from a bargaining perspective.
The whole land swaps issue is a fascinating issue on its own. But so basically, I can buy land in the crazies, let's say, that's around these trails, public trails. And then I can make it so no one can access these public trails. And then after years of making it impossible for the public to access, resulting in no maintenance, I can, with the help of the Forest Service, I can legally assert in a court setting that, well, nobody maintained them. Oh, I happen to be blocking it. So now they're not even really real anymore. That's the case?
Yeah, I mean that could definitely be a case. And in this case specifically, the landowners themselves aren't in court, but the Forest Service is sort of making the case for them. Yeah, they're saying that. Yeah, the Forest Service is saying that yeah, because of landowner trail obstructions, basically they're saying because landowners blocked trails and we weren't able to maintain them and the public wasn't able to use them, these trails have ceased to have viable easements on them. Yeah, that's exactly the argument they're making.
Shouldn't the argument be their blocking is illegal or must be stopped by court order so we can maintain this access? I'm stunned. They don't make that argument ever.
Well, I mean, they have in the past. I mean, it's interesting. It's it's interesting the sort of tack they chose on in the crazies, because not too long ago, and I can't pull all the details right off my top of my head, but what case it's called, the Wonder Ranch case, sort of nearby, a landowner was blocking a public trail. I believe this is on the same forest. I think it's also on the Custer Gallatin National Forest. Excuse me. And in that case, the Forest Service took the landowner to court, and they proved in court that that the public had enjoyed use of this trail for the statutory period, and that this trail deserved a public or a prescriptive easement, and was a public trail. And the court agreed and ruled against Wonder Ranch, and that trail is a public trail. Why they didn't do that in the crazies, I don't know if we'll ever know. I've asked them. They basically didn't respond to any of my questions that I put to them in this story. The Custer Gallatin National Forest representatives didn't decline to comment on any of those questions.
If this continues, how many public trails are we at risk, if you had to ballpark it, of losing access to? I mean, is this just like, oh, this is like 1 out of 1,000, or is this a major thing?
It's a major thing. I don't know the numbers. I don't know if anybody knows the numbers, because it's a lot easier to count. Like I said earlier, the Public Land and Water Access Association, which are probably the people who have the best idea of the scope of this in Montana, they estimated that if all of these, if all imperfected roads and trails went away overnight, that the Forest Service would lose access to more than half of its roads. More than half of its access points. So I think we're talking on the scale of like likely like a majority of the trails and roads that the public uses to access public land, at least in Montana. And I have no reason to think it's different across the other parts of the West. I know. Carry on.
You pointed out in the piece, I think it might have been about a land swap, where what they exchanged, it used to be a public trail that was like really beautiful, and then what the public got in return lacked a lot of things beyond just aesthetic beauty, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the second or the last third of the piece is about this land swap in the crazies. So basically, the landowners blocking public access to the east side of the mountains, and and just your listeners and sort of summarize how extensive that blocking of access is. So this practice of blocking public trails and public roads, especially on the east side of the mountains, is so widespread that now the Forest Service counts only one remaining public access along the Crazy Mountains' entire southeastern flank. So it's a huge chunk of the mountains is virtually inaccessible except by getting special permission from landowners.
And can the private landowners theoretically also disrupt and close down that one remaining, or
the one remaining one has a deeded
okay, got it,
a deeded recorded easement, so that one is should be pretty safe. I kind of totted up the figures, looking at a map and trying to, and counting up acreage, and calculated that basically this means that private landowners, that these access closures means that private landowners have made it much more difficult for the public to access more than 22,000 acres of Custer Gallatin National Forest land. So those landowners, Crazy Mountain landowners, have for many years made it clear what they want in exchange for quote unquote resolving these trail disputes. They want national forest land. They want public land. It's a really complicated affair, but basically in 2022, the Forest Service submitted such a land exchange for public review. In numbers, the exchange sounds pretty good for the public. For 7 parcels of public land in the Eastern Crazies, the Forest Service would get 10 parcels of private land. But on the ground, the discrepancy in the land becomes really stark. Basically, what would happen, to summarize, is the Forest Service would gain a lot of land that's along ridges and sort of peaks and steep slopes, basically, and the private landowners would gain most of the sweetgrass drainage, so this flat, low-lying area that runs up into the mountains, and a lot of the foothills, the sort of grassy foothills country along the eastern flank of the mountains. I think the really frightening thing about this land exchange is that it would make these low-lying areas, and this is particularly the Sweetgrass Creek drainage, extremely vulnerable to luxury development. The land exchange as written now has virtually no protections against development for these lands that would be leaving the public domain, as far as you want.
And I believe the Crow Indians, right? I believe they've raised some objections because of the spiritual significance of the mountains.
Well,
or am I wrong there?
So there's a whole issue there between what's been promised by the landowner David Lucian, who's a party to the exchange, the billionaire I was talking about earlier, and what's actually included in the text. One of the things that he promised and that was sort of sold to the public during this process was he promised that the Crow were going to get access to Crazy Peak, when in perpetuity. As far as I understand, there's nothing like that in the actual exchange text right now. So it's really there's several things like that were really promoted as the public benefits of this exchange, which are not actually in any way enshrined in the actual text of the exchange. So yeah, so basically it's really unclear whether those things will be delivered or not.
But I believe that some Crow, or the Crows, it isn't super developed, and so this would allow for the noise and development that could, and maybe I'm wrong, that could sort of soil the relaxing nature of this the Crazies. Or am I wrong?
I can certainly speak to this sort of, I think probably I can't speak to the tribe's perspective on this exchange exactly, but I have reported before about the Crow tribe concerns about development in the Crazies some years ago, when David Lucian started developing sort of a cabin or cabins on sort of his high mountain inn holdings. It was the first he was built using a helicopter to build these cabins way up high in the mountains, 8,000 feet up. And I broke that story, and I know that the Crow tribe and some Crow tribe members are very concerned at that time about development in the mountains.
What type of development? Is it like, McDonald's or shopping malls, or what worries you?
Oh, I think with this land exchange, I basically worry, I worry about just sort of high-end housing and resort development along Sweetgrass Creek. I think if this land exchange goes through and there are no really strong protections against that kind of development, I would be very surprised if in my lifetime that, that area doesn't look something like the Yellowstone Club. It's and the way I put it in the piece is basically it's it's easy to get lost in the sort of the details of the land exchange, and it is extremely complicated. But I think the bottom line is that by blocking public access to the crazies, these landowners have set the stage for a land exchange that would hand over really choice pieces of that land to them. At a time when the value of that kind of land in Montana and the West is going through the roof. A lot of these landowners will say and have said that they don't have any plans to develop it. They want to keep it. They want to keep it as it is, and that may be true. They may not have any development dreams.
Children might be different.
Yeah, I mean, plenty of others definitely do have development goals. And as one group, the Park County Environmental Council, which is a group with a very complicated relationship to this exchange, but even they came out against it in the end, arguing that, this is a quote, to quote them, even if current landowners have no intention of subdividing or selling the property, this consolidated land far up into the Sweetgrass drainage will eventually be too valuable not to. And I think that's accurate.
And just to confirm what Joseph is saying, I went to Big Sky, Montana, to the Yellowstone Club. I didn't get in through the imposing gates, but I drove around it. And then I drove by the crazies. And Big Sky, Montana is it feels like just you got to be a rich person to even walk the streets, sort of. I mean, I might be wrong, but that area by the club, it's like
no, you're right. That's it's not for regular people, or
you feel like you might be arrested for walking around. That's the kind of the elite sort of area that has become, whereas the crazies seem like this is still sort of open to the common person, and that might be lost. But I just want to, what you said is also crazy. So they're using blocking public access as leverage in these land swap negotiations.
I think that they haven't said that directly, but I think if you read between the lines, that's exactly what has happened here. They have blocked access. They know the Forest Service is under pressure to restore access, and so they have made it pretty clear. I have a letter from 2017 from some of these landowners in which they say is like the Forest Service there may be an opportunity to resolve some of these issues through a land exchange.
Oh my God! So they're dangling public roads as leverage in these land swap negotiations, where they, or at least their children, may profit handsomely, potentially.
I think that you could easily interpret it that way, and I think
please don't sue me, David Lucian. I'm sorry.
I think I certainly think that these landowners are securing great value for themselves through this land exchange process. These are valuable pieces of land that we're talking about, especially in the current context. And for what it's worth, it's threatening things that are of value to the public and and using that as a tactic to bring land agencies to the bargaining table. It's not unheard of. I mean, to give you another example of somewhere else where something similar has happened, in the Valle Seco bootjack land exchange in Colorado. Billionaire Kelsey Warren, who's the guy who's the co-founder of Energy Transfer Partners, which was the company that built the Dakota Access Pipeline. But he had bought a ranch in Colorado, the Bootjack Ranch, about $46.5 million ranch, and then he also later bought this Valle Seco inholding in the San Juan National Forest, and then locked a gate across a Forest Service road that accessed thousands of acres of national forest land.
That was the case I was referring to before that I was amazed by. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, and then basically, according to the Forest Service, made it clear that if the agency declined to trade him lands adjacent to his Bootjack Ranch, in exchange for that inholding, that they expected he would proceed with his plans to fence in the inholding, turn it into an elk farm, and build a hunting lodge. Not surprisingly, the agency made the trade, and I think, in this case where you have sort of access to public trails and the crazies kind of on the line, and you have a whole side of the mountains that is basically inaccessible to the public, and the Forest Service is feeling pressure to do something about that case, or to do something about that situation. I think they'll make this trade too. They'll go through with it, and the landowners will walk away with really valuable land.
I gotta repeat what you just said, because this is so insane. This super wealthy guy buys all this land that includes this Forest Service road that's very important. He shuts it down. That alone is just mind-boggling that is allowed legally. That's bad enough. And then he's able to not just shut out to basically close down the Forest Service road, but then he uses that as leverage to get public land in a land swap that hugely, benefits him alone rather than the public. Am I wrong? Is that what you just described?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. That's how I read the Forest Service documents on that case. Yeah.
Am I maybe I'm nuts, but are people appalled by that? Is there outrage?
I don't know how widely known it is. I think that there's probably outrage in Colorado, and maybe in that area. I know that people who I've talked to who have been following land exchanges for a while are really appalled by the whole process. This lawyer in Colorado, Travis Stills, that I talked to, he called land exchanges he said they're just invitations for corruption. Basically what he means by that is that it's illegal for the U.S. agencies, as I understand it, to sell public land. They can't just sell land to a private landowner. So what the land exchange avenue allows is for really wealthy landowners to kind of get creative with how they get a hold of this land that they might want. They can't buy it outright, but what can they do to sort of put pressure on the land agency to trade them the land that they want? Can they buy some adjacent land and then threaten it in various ways? Can they buy up a bunch of sort of sensitive wildlife habitat and say, hey, do you want this, or do you want us to develop it? So that's what he means by the just invitations for corruption. He talks about this Government Accountability Office study that looked at more than 1,000 land exchanges and found that government agencies regularly overvalued the lands that they acquired and undervalued the lands they traded away. And then actually the Government Accountability Office recommended that Congress consider discontinuing the program because it was so flawed.
Basically, what I'm seeing is if you're wealthy enough, and please don't sue me, David Lucian, but he does live in New York, so he's this hugely wealthy, successful New York investor. Nothing wrong with that, but he just, if you're really wealthy, you just go out to Colorado or Montana and boy, I really love this part of this mountain and this creek. Damn, it's public land. And you can basically hire these specialty land swap firms, I guess.
Yep.
And they give them a ton of money and a ton of lawyers. And I would presume they get to basically rip off a much less well-funded, group of Forest Service people. I mean, is that sort of the general case?
So yes, I mean, like what happened in the case with the crazies is that, like I said, it's stupidly complicated. But basically, how this came about is the Yellowstone Club, not exactly near the crazies, though they have moved in recent years, but over by Big Sky. But they wanted some public land to expand their private ski resort over there. They wanted this little scrap of public land, 500 acres or something like that, 400 and some acres. The Forest Service wouldn't trade with them because they didn't see any public benefit in it. But they said, they pretty much made it clear that, the crazies were their priority. And if the club would pay to, do the legwork of hammering out an exchange in the crazies, then they could talk about trading that land in the Madison Range. So the Yellowstone Club is the one that so this crazy swap that we're talking about is paired with this one in the Madison Range. And the Yellowstone Club is the one that goes out and hires Western Land Group, which is one of these businesses that specializes in land exchanges. That company, does all the legwork of getting together deeds and hosting negotiations, doing all the stuff to put together this land exchange, which they then bring to the Forest Service. It's also
insane.
yeah,
This is
and
insane.
the Yellowstone Club also at the same time is running this. Well, let's see how to say this. So in addition to hiring Western Land Group to hammer out this exchange, they hire another company called Western Skies Strategies, which arranges, this is not in the story, but which arranges a large grant for a local conservation organization called the Park County Environmental Council. And the Park County Environmental Council uses that money to start this other group called the Crazy Mountain Access Project. And they set up a website, they host these public meetings, they put out this kind of slick looking material promoting the land exchange. It's basically, it's not clear from any of the material that this money has been arranged by a company that's working for the Yellowstone Club. So it's
neutral, right?
Yeah, it's and so that's why I see that Park County Environmental Council has a really complicated relationship to this exchange, because they have come out against it here at the end, but they've done a great deal to facilitate and to promote the exchange to the point that it's at right now.
I should rephrase my question about are people appalled? I know very few people because of the details. Thanks to you, and God bless you for what you're doing. You are raising awareness for ignorant people like me, but obviously this is not like a mass issue.
Right.
This is not in the presidential debates. But what I should have said is among the forest community, the people, when you talk to forest rangers and locals and people related to it, is my attitude of like, how is this even possible? Do they have the same feelings?
Yeah, I mean, in Montana, public lands are a big issue, and access to them is a big issue. And on this case, in these cases, like people are appalled about what's happening in the crazies in other places where landowners block access to public land. And then the fact that they can um, turn that into things like this land exchange that benefits them in various ways is doubly appalling to a lot of people that I've talked to. And if you read through the public comments, there's thousands of public comments on this exchange that were submitted to the Forest Service, and I haven't read all of them, but the vast majority of the ones I've read are appalled that the Forest Service is even considering this proposal because it seems to be it seems like such a bad deal to a lot of the public commenters.
I just want to reiterate what you explained, because this is also insane. The Yellowstone Club wants this public land. They're trying to negotiate with the Forest Service, and the Forest Service is saying, okay, maybe we'll do it, but hey, could you help us get access to what I think they should be saying is our roads over in this other mountain range? It's crazy. I wonder, talking to lawyers who work on this issue, are they, I mean, I'm surprised there hasn't been like a landmark case that has sort of settled the rules of the road about these roads. Is that the case? And are they trying to get that? Because personally, I think this should just be like, I don't know, a Supreme Court case where it's like, nope, the public has a right to all of this land and you can't close it. I mean, not the land, but these roads, and they can't be closed. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting. There hasn't been a landmark case. There's been a few different cases that are relevant. I talked about the 4Access groups who have sued the Forest Service, but all they can do though is sue the Forest Service and try to get the agency to defend these roads. They can't. The only way that the actual status of these roads and trails could be resolved is if the Forest Service itself sued the landowners and those cases went to court, and the court ruled on whether there were valid prescriptive easement claims or not. So that's the really frustrating thing, I think, for the access groups, is that they can't personally take these landowners to court. They have to get the Forest Service to do it, and the Forest Service so far won't do it.
So there could be such a landmark case, but the Forest Service would have to initiate that. Yeah. And they haven't done that.
Yeah, not in the crazies. Like they had to in the Wonder Ranch case I talked about, they have, but yeah.
But the ruling there, it wasn't. See, I would think that one of those cases would, hopefully decree a national law regarding that stuff. Is that not possible?
I think it's, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer or legal expert on this, but as I understand it, these prescriptive easements have to be worked out on a case-by-case basis.
I wonder, why isn't this like something that Democrats like? Why is the Biden administration doing anything to fight for public access? Or
not that I know of. I don't know why it's not. It's certainly I'd love to see a politician who would run a campaign that was a campaign about land and about access to land, and about the inequity of access to land. I think that would be, I'd love to see that campaign, but I don't know of anybody running that campaign right now.
Well, let's step back. I thought your piece had sort of a beautiful ending about what is the larger issues at stake here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm talking about at the end of the piece is, in addition to my sort of like personal connections to that landscape, I'm talking about the sort of the importance of having personal connections to land. I think it's something that is increasingly not a part of our culture, and I think that's extremely, not only it's kind of sad, and we're all sort of poorer for it, but I think it's also dangerous, and in a time when you know when climate change and sort of the all the different environmental crises are just kind of shaking the terrain under our feet. To not have our feet planted in some kind of relationship to ground and to land is an increasingly dangerous place to stand. And so I think our times demand that all of us try to make land personal again, and deepen our relationships with the ecosystems that we are a part of, whether we like it or not. And this kind of connection and relationship that I'm talking about, and I think at least I've only found it through participation in the land, through being out there on it, in having a through hunting and through fishing, through just participating as as another participant among participants in land, not as just a visitor or a sort of observer.
It makes
And
you
I think,
feel the stakes of the
yeah,
climate crisis.
to feel the stakes. And I think, and for most of us who don't own land, mm, like public land offers the only chance we have for that kind of participation, and for rebuilding that relationship to land. And that's I quote District Ranger Sienkiewicz in the piece, what he said in a letter he wrote to one of the trail blocking landowners. He said, for most kids, the national forest is the only quote unquote ranch they'll ever own.
What are these landowners, if you've talked to them, what is their side of the story? Is it like, well, they leave trash and, like, or do they have like sort of a defense?
Yeah. Almost all of them declined to talk to me for this story. I've had some conversations with various people over the years. I think the landowner who did respond by email to my request, Ned Zimmerman, who's the one who blocked the porcupine lowlands. Actually, the Zimmerman's fence that we cross at the beginning of the article, the no trespassing sign and stuff on the porcupine lowline. And his perspective is that the Forest Service was making claims of access to their property, which he says were beyond their legal authority, because they had no written easement. And he says that in order to show that they weren't okay with this, they locked the gates across. He says we locked the gates to our property. He means the gates across the trail. So they see it, from what I've been able to understand, they see it as a, I don't know, something like federal overreach, or the Forest Service.
But it's not like, people trying to access these trails have murdered families, or is that happening? Are people using public trails to rob people? That's not the case,
not
right?
that I know of. No, not that I know of. That's not the.
So they
not
just
the
don't
issue.
want people in their sort of huge backyard. That's the sense I'm getting. I don't.
Yeah, I think I can't see inside the mind of some of these landowners. I think that one thing, and I could speculate about their motives. In the piece, I've tried to nail down where I could sort of the direct financial incentives that people have for cutting off access to public land. And I think in any case, extinguishing a public trail across land probably raises its value. I think it's I think the name of the game, as I talk about in the this sort of the new economy in the West, where there's just this booming new market for exclusive wilderness experiences, of various kinds. And the the more exclusive you can make them, the more valuable they are. So
You can make a ton of money making basically de facto private the kind of hunting that might have once been public, right? I mean,
yeah,
basically.
yeah. I mean
Yeah.
that's unfortunately, this is like literally what's happening on the east side of the range. That's it's probably happening elsewhere too, but I have the best documentation for it on the east side, where, like I said before, the Rhine Anchor Ranch and the Sweetgrass Ranch, both of whom obstruct public access and control public access up Sweetgrass Creek drainage. They also run businesses that profit from selling access to the land and animals in that drainage that they block the public from accessing.
To pull even further back, I heard somebody say it was like some restaurateur, and he was giving advice to people who wanted to get into like restaurants and bars. And he basically said, all these like old bars that used to serve like sort of the working class, quote unquote, around sort of cities like Chicago or whatever, you don't want to be in that. You want to be in the most upscale bar, and it's like a lot of the new buildings, they don't want to build stuff for like the common person. They want the tall glass thing
Yeah,
for the super rich.
yeah,
And it seems like this reflects that this we're going to this sort of like Brazil level of inequality where the rich want to have their own areas and they really don't want to have to deal with the proles. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
do you agree that that's sort of what's kind of going on in our society?
Well, I mean, it's certainly what I see in the West, and I think, yeah, probably the society at large. But I mean, I certainly see it in the West. What is happening is, as wealth moves in and as these areas sort of gentrify at breakneck pace, is yeah, you're really seeing communities that are almost completely hollowed out, where the people who actually run the place, the people who do the service jobs and stuff, can't really afford to live anywhere nearby. And so, like down in Colorado, where I did some reporting, where I think this sort of form of outdoorsy gentrification is further along and more complete. I think it's kind of the end game of what's happening in Montana, and elsewhere. Is the kind of the state of things around like Vail and Aspen and stuff. And what you see there is that, aside from some people who live in the employer provided housing down in Vail, for example, most of so many thousands of the workers who actually run the place, they come in from an hour or more away, over some pretty gnarly highways, down from people I was writing about, where a lot of Latino and Mexican families living up in Leadville, who were commuting in every day to clean the Airbnbs of Breckenridge and Vail, and go home to the trailer parks of Leadville. And I think that kind of setup is pretty common, becoming more common across the West.
You can be the janitor in Aspen, but you can never even dream of even living in a shack down by a river in Aspen. I mean, that seems emblematic. Thank you, Joseph, for your amazing reporting. Thank you for
Daniel.
opening our eyes to what's going on.
I appreciate your interest, and thanks for the conversation today.